Today's presentation is entitled An Introduction to Our State Tree, the Cabbage Palm. I'm Anastasia Sallin. I'm the Director of Environmental Education here at Marie Selby Botanical Gardens, and I'm totally thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Jono Miller. Jono is a natural historian, educator, and now an author. His book, the Palmetto book, Histories and Mysteries of the Cabbage Palm, is hot off the press, and this is what it looks like. Oh man, I hate it when this happens with the background. Hopefully Lauren can edit that in later. It's a collection of essays that cover both the natural and cultural history of the cabbage palm, and I just finished it. It's full of fun facts and poetic musings on this fascinating tree. Jono is a former director of environmental studies program at New College of Florida, and he's inspired many students over the years. Jono recently joined us on an Ecoflora Bio Blitz, and he cleared up the mystery of why we call the bases of cabbage palm leaves bootjacks. So I'm very excited to see what other mysteries of the cabbage palm he can clear up for us today. And without further ado, I will pass things off to Jono.
Let me share the screen. Thank you, Anastasia, and thanks, Selby, for doing this. Let's see if we can get there. Selby Gardens play. Okay, so I'm going to start at the beginning, and for most people, that's starting with a coconut. And if you Google palm tree, you will either get a coconut palm or a date palm. And it doesn't matter how many images you look at, you will never get to a cabbage palm. The archetypal palm tree that people think of when they think of palms is usually a coconut or a date. And so I'd like to start by helping people understand some of the differences between the two. So if you think about a coconut palm, the canopy, the fronds, each one tends to be rather conspicuous and individually distinct. They have that pinnate or feather-like structure with a central organizing organ that the leaflets or leaf segments off of that. You tend to be able to see the leaf scars going all the way around the trunk. The trunks frequently lean. They typically taper, being wider at the bottom and then getting narrower. And they're typically found in coastal settings. The cabbage palm, on the other hand, typically has a more spherical or haystack shape. The fronds are fan-like, and we'll talk about that more later. The leaf scars are pretty inconspicuous compared to a coconut. The trunk is typically vertical. There are many exceptions, but they tend to be straighter than coconuts. They typically do not taper, and they can be found either in coastal or inland areas. So the scientific name is Sable palmetto, and they're in the palm family, and we'll talk about that as well. In addition to the southeastern US and the Bahamas, they're also found in Cuba. So the historic range of the cabbage palm is most of peninsular Florida up the east coast to North Carolina, but not particularly far west on the Gulf Coast. And the sort of theoretical range of where they might grow is larger. And then I went to iNaturalist to look at where people have reported them. And so that pretty much tracks what that potential range map looks like. So there are a couple of other sables in Florida. There's the scrub palmetto, Sable etonia. This is one in a more landscape setting. They're typically found in a scrub and the white xeric sands. And then at the other end of the extreme is what I would call a swamp palmetto, Sable minor, and these tend to grow in wet areas. And these typically do not develop a trunk. So I mentioned the leaf was fan-like. The sable palm has this structure that's sort of spear-shaped called a costa, and it adds a lot of area where the leaf segments can originate from. So as a result, when the leaves are young, they look like soft palmetto leaves. They're pretty flat. There's not a lot of, aside from the pleating or folding of the leaf segments, there's not a lot of three-dimensionality. But then as they mature and grow more, get more mature, they take on a really three-dimensional shape, and that's pretty distinctive. They're no longer really fan-like. Now, As Anastasia mentioned, they have bootjacks, which is sometimes shortened to the word boots. And that occurs because when the leaves die, they remain on the tree. So they die with their boots on. And this is what it looks like. This is what you'll see around town where people have pruned some of the lower fronds off. And you can see they have a distinctive sort of Y shape. We can talk about that later if people are interested. So these are commercial bootjacks, and this is what people in most of the country have to use when they want to pull their boots off. But in Florida, we're privileged to have bootjacks growing right on trees. So you simply turn it over, step on one end, stick your boot in the Y shape, and then pull it off. It sort of does the opposite of a shoehorn. It helps you take footwear off. So that's why they're bootjacks. And so ones that still have their boots on are referred to as being booted, and where they've all fallen off, that's called slick if you want to buy some. And you can get them half and half. Now, in some cases, the leaves will appear to line up vertically, each one about 45 degrees rotated from the next. And so you might assume that each leaf comes out 45 degrees prior to the next, but actually it's about 135 degrees or 3 times. So 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You can see how it ping pongs back and forth, each additional leaf about 135 degrees from the previous leaf. So this is a cross section, through the developing trunk. Palms are not grasses. You can find plenty of stuff on the internet telling you that they are grasses, but all you need to do is go back to your Golden Nature Guide that I had when I was in 2nd grade, and you can see the palms are in one family and the grasses are in another family. Nobody goes around saying pineapples are cattails or irises or orchids, but it's pretty common to hear people say that palms are grasses, and they're simply not. So as volunteers at Selby, you have a chance to educate people and set them straight on some of these issues. They're very long-lived and they're very slow growing. They can live at least 200 years as far as I can tell. This is a photograph taken in the Second World War at New College, and then I tried to rephotograph the same tree in 75 years later, and you can see for 75 years, it didn't grow very much. These trees can produce a lot of shade, and it aggravates me when people talk about shade trees and canopy trees and they leave palms out. Miami Beach just decided they're going to plant fewer palm trees because they don't produce shade. And here, this is the shade produced by a single cabbage palm. Here's a smart shopper. He picked the parking space furthest from the Walmart entrance, but he parked there to be in the shade of these cabbage palms. This is from the Mayaca Canopy Walkway. And you can see there's not a lot of gaps there. And this is a place called Boar Hammock. And you can see 2 lanes, the 2 tire tracks. And that's the density of the cabbage palms. There's very little sunlight reaching the ground under there. So the point is, if you plant cabbage palms close to each other, you can create as much shade as people can tolerate. Cabbage palms are routinely over pruned. This is at my mother-in-law's place, and I thought this was the worst I'd ever seen till I went to Jacksonville. These are not recent transplants. These trees have been there a while. This qualifies as abuse. And so sometimes I ask people to actually count how many green fronds are removed. So if you want to count, you can, but it goes by pretty quickly. But I just want to show you the scope of devastation. This is a cabbage palm at the Selby Library downtown. So every green leaf that's cut off is removing the photosynthetic capacity of the tree. You'll see he uses one hand. I believe that's a complete violation of OSHA. You're not supposed to operate a chainsaw with one hand. And when I went down with professional frond harvesters on the Seminole Reservation, they use a machete to harvest fronds, and they can't believe that people use heavy chainsaws when it's so much easier to just whack it once or twice with a machete. So we're actually paying people good money to to sort of cripple these trees. They will survive this, and I'll talk about that later, about how can it be that you can remove this much from a plant and still have it recover. There's a story behind that, but it really is pretty egregious how many fronds or what percentage of the tree's canopy is removed during these pruning process. And if you can see how the tree starts to taper there, anytime you're seeing it pruned in such a way that that taper is visible, it's being over pruned. I think he's almost done. He looks down at me there. He's wondering why I'm taking video of him. So here's what accrues on the ground. And all those fronds have to be picked up, whether you cut them all at once or just let them fall. So the city of St. Augustine Beach recently overpruned their palms. A gentleman sent me a before and after picture from the same vantage point. So I was able to animate that. Let's see if it'll work. Yeah, so here's before and after. And you can see how that taper creeps in. That's really a sign of overpruning. So I wrote about this on my blog. It's called palmettobook.blog if you want to check it out. But the pruning standards have changed. And so it used to be that they would tell you not to prune green fronds, but you could prune up to a horizontal line from 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock. And they used this illustration. And here's something from IFAS with a complete mixed message. You're only supposed to remove dead fronds or ones that are below 180-degree horizontal plane. So telling people to do two contradictory things. But the pruning standards have changed. In 2017, they were revised. There's no longer any mention of 9 o'clock to 3 o'clock or horizontal plane. And the only reason you should remove green fronds is for clearance. If they're interfering with a driveway, a sidewalk, a power line, a building, go ahead and cut as many green fronds as you want to. But otherwise, that's not the current recommended practice. And this is very common in homeowner associations struggle with this issue where they're frequently overpruned. Here's what IFAS said, so that they're kind of internally contradictory, but they again say, just leave the green fronds, particularly on the cabbage palm. These are incredibly tough, resilient trees. They're basically unaffected by fire, they're unaffected by flooding and cold weather. And there was a really interesting book written after that year we had the 4 bad hurricanes. So here's what they look like when they're burning. Here's another shot. And this was taken on Egmont Key after a fire went through. And you can see, this helps to explain why you can remove most of the green fronds and have the tree recover. Cabbage palms live in communities that are burned, have natural fire from lightning strikes. And if they couldn't recover from a severe fire, they wouldn't be there. So this is stressful for the tree, but the majority of the leaves can be burned off and it will resprout. So people in the landscaping business take advantage of this resilience of the tree to further abuse it by cutting the fronds off when they don't need to. As I said, they're very tolerant of flooding. This is shot on the Mayaca River. The hammocks along the Mayaca flood every year. The trees can be underwater for weeks at a time and they're unaffected. There are very few trees that can tolerate that. They have a very high wind tolerance. They did very well after Andrew. This is a picture from that book, Stormscaping. You see a live oak on the right that has virtually no twigs and no leaves. The cabbage palm is pretty busted up, but it's still got its leaves. Here's a scene from the Panhandle from, I believe, Michael, and you can see the pine trees had all the needles ripped off it, and the cabbage palm still has green fronds. And then we'll come back. And they're cold tolerant as well. And we're learning a lot right now about from Texas about what palm trees can take severe cold. And what I'm hearing is that the sables are doing about as well as any. However, despite all their resilience and toughness, they are being threatened by a new disease called lethal bronzing. It's a strange disease. You can find a number of them that are dead and dying. And then in the same location, you'll see healthy ones, young ones, and ones that seem to be in good shape. This is Brian Bader. He's doing, he's leading the research for IFAS, and there's a tree dying of lethal bronzing in the background there. Lethal bronzing was first identified in Texas in 1980. It was found in a Phoenix palm tree, so it was dubbed Texas Phoenix palm decline. It was first found in Florida around 2006, and it was the same genetically, so they called it Texas Phoenix palm decline. It's caused by a phytoplasma, which is similar to a bacteria, but which lacks a cell wall. It's spread by an insect. I'll show you a picture of that. And it's now called lethal bronzing. So this is the insect Aplaxius crudus. And it can move around in 4 different ways, which is problematic. So you could take an infected palm with or without the insects and move it somewhere, and that could be a problem. The insect vector could be moved with the palms. The insect can move by itself, and Dr. Bader has found it on his car windshield. And the phytoplasma can also occur in other plants. So there's no easy way to, there's no single way to stop the movement or transmission of the disease. So the symptoms, it starts with necrosis of the flowers. The flowers will die, and then the premature fruit drop. If somebody's pruned off all your flowers and fruit, you're not going to notice that. But then the next stage you'll see is the bronzing of the older lower leaves, and that works its way up the tree. Eventually the spear leaf, which is the central newest upright leaf, will collapse. And then you're in what he calls the woodpecker phase. So here you see the dying leaves moving up the tree, no longer confined to just sort of the bottom tier. And then it'll look like this, and the spear leaf's not even visible there. So that's a goner. That's what the spear leaf looks like when it's emerging and healthy. And there's the woodpecker phase. So there is a way to tell if you have the disease in your tree. It involves sterilizing a drill and collecting a sample and keeping it cold. And if you're interested, you can access this IFAS publication that explains how to do it and where to send it. It costs about $75 to have it tested. You can sort of hold it off with oxytetracycline, but it has to be repeated 4 times a year. It leaves holes in the tree. It's expensive. It would really only make sense for a specimen tree, I would think. And once it's diagnosed with this disease, it's fatal. There's no cure. And so the recommendation is if it tests positive, get it out of there before these insects can feed on the part tissue and then move it to another plant. These are very important species for wildlife. They, woodpeckers and other species will nest in the dead palms. The woodpeckers, here's a downy. You'll hear the downy working on the dead petioles, the leaf stems. And that's what some of the damage looks like where they've been feeding. Animals will lay their eggs in the bases of the bootjacks. Squirrels harvest the material for their nests. Frogs hang out under the leaves, both native and exotic Cuban tree frogs. Raccoons will climb up in them. Raccoons eat a lot of palm fruit. And the way we know that is just by walking around and being observant. Mourning doves, they'll nest there. You can find frogs in the hollow palm logs, just like an old cartoon. The northern yellow bat does not nest in attics or bat houses. It only nests in palm fronds and Spanish moss. Ospreys will perch there, but they also nest there occasionally when there are not a lot of other trees. It's important food for migratory birds. Here's a cedar waxwing gorging on cabbage palm fruit. Scrub jays use the fibers from the palm to line their nest. And there you can see two nestlings. And those are the fibers that occur in between the leaf segments. And this is what the nest looks like. So you can imagine how pokey and spiny the nest would be without that lining. There's a great horned owl hanging out on one. Vultures roost in them. This is at Lower Myakka Lake. And you see to the right of Julie's hand some scratch marks. Bears will climb up into cabbage palms to eat the heart and also the fruit, and apparently sometimes just to take a nap. Turtles and alligators rely on them in the water to come out and sunbathe. And at exotic animal parks, you can find non-native species feeding on cabbage palms as well. Now, they're really important for pollinator species. I don't think so much butterflies, but when they're blooming in the summer and into the fall, the number of flies and wasps, including honeybees and bees, including honeybees, really, they just cover these blossoms. And there can be, I believe I calculated like 1 million flowers on a single tree. So it's a very important source of nectar for a lot of species. And as I was telling Anastasia before we started, people typically think of sources for pollinators as being below waist height, but cabbage palms are important. And if you look, it's not typically a source of allergies because they're, unlike wind pollinated trees are going to have lighter pollen that you're more likely to inhale. This, I believe, is a relatively heavy pollen, so it's not likely to be wafting about so much. Cabbage palms can be invasive. Some people don't like me saying that because they think if it's a native tree, it can have no faults, but they are invasive. This is not grass. These are all cabbage palm seedlings coming up in a neighbor's yard. Then you get to a stage that looks like this. And by the time these are this big, you cannot pull them out of the ground. You can cut them off and they'll resprout, but you can't pull them out. And then they get to this size. And what's going on here is this homeowner probably only has a pair of loppers. They don't have a chainsaw. And so all they can do is periodically cut the fronds off. And as a result, they just keep, they have a lot of underground reserves and they just keep sending up new leaves. So then it looks sort of like this. But, you know, it's not always a bad thing that they're invasive, and I'll show you why. Here's a, I believe this is a Lowe's. This is a volunteer. This tree was not planted there. It came up. The people doing the landscaping couldn't kill it easily, and it's growing. Eventually, it'll provide shade for people that are, you know, waiting for their spouse to come out of the store. Here's a whole row of volunteer cabbage palms in downtown Sarasota. If they hadn't germinated there, this would be a big blank wall and just another invitation for graffiti. Right now, it's actually producing some oxygen. Now, I know Sobe folks typically or stereotypically are interested in epiphytes. I thought I'd go over a few of the fern epiphytes that are common. Resurrection fern is not particularly common on cabbage palms. I mostly see it on leaning trunks. But it's really neat. Here it is growing on a roof with a lot of debris. They're a very small fern. And they have this ability to curl up and dry out and then rehydrate themselves. So according to Wikipedia, they can lose as much as 97% of their water and still bounce back, which makes it really spectacular, and kids are fascinated by this. Then there's the golden polypody fern. These are really big. These can be more than 3 feet long. They're typically found on cabbage palms. And the petiole, the stem of the leaf stem of the frond is above, and below is that old brown lamp cord that your grandmother had running to her lamps, and it looks almost exactly like lamp cord, but that groove down the center. The new growth, the feet can either be golden or a rust color, or when they're old, they tend to look brownish. And there's some of the unfurling fronds. And they're usually found on sable palms, but these are growing on decomposing cedar shingles. Eventually, by the end of the year, they get tired and eventually fall off. Now, there's a variety called Blue Star, which people claim is the same species. And I corresponded. So look, you see how blue those rhizomes are, and they're not particularly hairy. It's hard to believe it's the same species. Dr. Chambers here at Moat, I corresponded with her a little bit about it. So it's just really confusing how two plants that can look so completely different might be considered the same species. They might be confused with wart fern or monarch fern. And Phimatosaurus always sounded like a dinosaur to me, but it's a fern. And so the sori on the undersides are kind of elliptical and actually look a little like warts, whereas the golden polypody, if you've had to give it a name, you'd probably call it the pimple fern instead of wart fern. And another one is the shoestring fern. And this is mostly on sable palms as well. It can be found in other situations. It's pretty distinctive. It seems to like moister areas. To me, they remind me of the beard on a turkey gobbler, the way they hang down. And then finally, the rarest palm in native fern, I should say, in Florida is the hand palm. And this is one that I photographed in the Fekahatchee, I believe. And these have a really crazy distribution. They're found in Madagascar and Seychelles and Vietnam, but also in Florida. But they're very rare. They were apparently collected, and they cannot be grown in captivity, which then fern lovers want to go out and dig one out and prove that that's wrong. And so they believe at the moment, FNA believes there are only about 50 populations remaining in the state. And let me check the time here. Okay, we're still good. I wanted to go over, introduce you to some local cabbage palms. So this is one at, well, I should say one, it's a clump, but these are at Eagle Point Club. So you can see this one's forked and it has two heads. This is the entrance you see to Eagle Point Club. And then this one up here, forks, I think there were 3 on that one. This one also has 3. So I believe this clump was found in Manatee County and dug up and brought down to the Eagle Point Club. And it's an example of some of these palms that have multiple heads. These are right near you here on Osprey. When next time you drive down Osprey, you'll notice these if you haven't already. I call them the Watrous palms because that was the family that lived there, but there are these 4 palms that all lean distinctively on Osprey, or orange, I should say. This one was growing on an alleyway north of Main Street, and it was coming out of this concrete bollard that was protecting the phone pole. It's no longer there, it was cut down. And it reminded me of one that was growing outside a bar in New Orleans. I really don't have any experience with bars in New Orleans, but this one was there. And when you look at it, this one is also now dead. Looks like this, according to Google Earth. But it's hard to believe that people think, well, there must have been a hole cut in the bottom. It couldn't possibly live in that tiny little planter. But when you go to a trade show for landscape plants, you can see a cabbage palm growing out of something the same size. This is the root ball on a regenerated palm. Here's one that's upside down. So yes, they can grow and survive in a really small area. the root area. Now, if you're interested in epiphytes, you could get a copy of Palmetto, the most recent issue of the Florida Native Plant Society newsletter, and I have an article in there about trees that cohabit with cabbage palms. So here's a cabbage palm that's out at the Wells Fargo Bank on St. Armand's, and it's a giant strangler fig, and the palm seems perfectly happy. If you go down Camino Real, you'll see the strangler pine. This pine seed must have germinated at the base of a bootjack near the ground and got its roots down to the ground, and now is giving this palm tree a nice hug. And some of the most famous palms in Sarasota are the Palm Avenue 26. These trees were all going to be cut down and sent to the landfill. And we eventually found out that 6 of them had actually been planted in 1911. They were older than the city of Sarasota itself. And here's a picture of those trees from the 20s. So they've been providing good service for more than 100 years. They're the oldest landscape trees in downtown Sarasota. And this is what they look like now. It's been re-landscaped. 6 of them are still there. The others were planted more recently, and they put lights on them, which look pretty nice. Okay, but wait, there's more. As Anastasia said, I did write this book, the Palmetto book. And this is what it looks like in its native habitat in a bookstore. You can get them at Bookstore 1. And I also have the blog I mentioned. So this is palmettobook.blog, and I post new material. Some of it's humorous, some of it's factual, but I try to correlate it with different chapters in the book. So there's the blog. I'm also on Instagram, where I post pictures of cabbage palms. There's the book itself. And then if you want to correspond, you can write to me at cabbagepalm@gmail. And we'll try questions for a while. So let me stop sharing and then escape and get back here.
Jono, thank you so much for that. I think for the Q&A, I'll invite everyone they can either chat in the chat box to ask questions, or
I can't hear you. You're muted, I believe, Anastasia. Is that possible? Oh wait, I've muted you. Go ahead. Try that again.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Awesome. So for the Q&A, you can tap your questions into the chat box, or you can wave, and my colleague Lauren will unmute you, and you can ask your question to Jono.
Okay, so there's a question about the lethal bronzing. No, it's not a locust. It looks like a locust because it fills the screen, but it's actually about the size of a Tic Tac. It's a really small little guy, and I still haven't learned to spot them on cabbage palms. They're very tiny, and they don't know how to control it yet. They have some theories, some hypothetical strategies on how to control it. It's believed that the nymphs, the younger insects, feed on something like grass before they move into the palm trees. So one theory is that if you have a setting, say a hammock at Mayaca Park, that floods annually and there's no real bahia or grassy understory, those trees might be relatively safe. But there's a concern that the movement of sod might be moving the insects in the earlier stages, but they don't. Obviously, there's a difference between trying to manage and control this insect in, say, a botanical garden versus in Mayaca River State Park. So if you have a few trees, there might eventually be a strategy that could work with a systemic or something, but that would be totally impractical in nature. And there are two different issues. One is how much genetic variability is there among the cabbage palms, and how much genetic variability is in the phytoplasma. So far, all the phytoplasma they've tested has been really the same. And I don't know how much is known about the variability of cabbage palms, but you can see if there were, just as we're going through with COVID, if there were a lot of variants of the phytoplasma, that would put more trees at risk. So it's kind of an unknown right now. Dr. Bader's studying it, but it's not likely to get a lot of funding from the legislature the way the citrus industry does.
Dennis has a question. Some people in our condo object to sable palms.
Right.
Draw rats.
They draw rats. I love this rat. I love the rat issue. So the cabbage palms that were on Palm Avenue that I showed you, one of the complaints about that was that rats were living in them. So I walked down, there's an alley behind Main Street, behind where Selva and Melvin's and all those restaurants, the ice cream shop, there's an alley behind there. And it's an experience to walk down there because just like, just garbage, it's like it's a rat smorgasbord. So there are rats everywhere. There are rats at Selby Gardens, there are rats around City Hall, there are rats at my house, there are rats at your house. Wherever you live, there are rats. And the question is, where do you want them? Do you want them in your house? Do you want them in your attic? Or would you rather have them in a nice palm tree? And I would rather have them climb up at night and hang out in the palm tree than be in the house. But that's my preference. The other thing about rats is, aside from the restaurants downtown, people put out bird feeders and the birds scatter the seed, it lands on the ground and the rats eat that. People have fruit trees, they have citrus and avocados and mangoes. The rats eat those. People have compost piles that aren't closed, they just sort of dump their apple cores or banana peels out there. That's feeding the rats. People put food out for their cat or for the raccoons. So your neighbors are already feeding rats through their behavior. And so even if you cut down every cabbage palm, you would still have rats and people would still be feeding them. So yes, I'm sure there are rats in the cabbage palms. Some people take a sheet aluminum and wrap it around the palm to create a slippery surface the rats can't climb up. And I think it looks hideous, it probably works, but then the question is, where do those rats live if they can't climb up in their tree? So personally, I think people should be planting more palm trees to provide places for the rats to hang out and keep them out of your house. What else do we have?
I have a question for you, Jono, and that's how did this all begin? You're known as the cabbage palm guy, and reading your book, I'm just amazed at all of the time that you've dedicated to this topic. So I want to know how it started, and a little bit about the journey.
Well, I was interested in natural history at a very young age. I still have my Golden Nature Guides from 2nd grade, and I still have my tree issue that shows the cabbage palm. So even in 2nd grade, I knew cabbage palms were trees. And I came down to Sarasota in 1970 to attend New College and started taking environmental classes. And I don't think I was particularly interested in cabbage palms any more than anything else. You need to understand the fire ecology of the flatwoods, and the mangroves are interesting. Everything was interesting. Then in about 81, I believe a friend of mine asked me to do an illustration for her husband's birthday. And I don't know whether she specified what she wanted or it was just up to me, but I went down to Lower Mayaca Lake and I did a pen and ink illustration of the marsh at the lower lake as viewed through a cabbage palm hammock with one oak tree. And at that time, those cabbage palms were young and they were covered with bootjacks. And so for an artist who wasn't working from a photograph, trying to understand the angles and how all these leaves were attached, and I just got really drawn in, like, this is crazy. Like with the oak tree, you just sort of draw the trunk and the branching and then squiggle around for the leaves or whatever. But with the cabbage palm, you had to like draw each bootjack because you couldn't really cut corners on it. So that got me interested in the structure of them. And I just over the years started accumulating different questions, like how long do these things live and whatever. Ultimately, there was a student at New College who was looking for a thesis. And I sort of, the classic back of the envelope, I wrote down about 20 questions and said, if you could answer these questions, it'd be a really neat thesis. Well, they picked a different thesis topic. And so I sort of inherited this list that I'd created, and I hadn't gone to graduate school. So I heard a lecture in Jacksonville at a land acquisition conference. And Dr. Gary Mormino from USF St. Pete with their Florida Studies program, and he was talking about the history of the orange industry in Florida. And I went up to him afterwards and I was comparing some of my observations about the orange industry and what was happening in Brazil and blah, blah, blah. And he knew his daughter had gone to New College. He knew I was at New College, but he assumed I had a PhD. And I said, no, I graduated from New College, that's it. And he said, well, you should come to my graduate program. And I said, yeah, that's been like 35 years. I'm not really interested in taking the GREs. And he said, no, you don't have to take the GREs to go to graduate school. Just send me a writing sample. So I'd written a chapter in a book about the 10,000 islands. I sent it to him. They let me in the graduate program, and then I had to pick a thesis. And my choices were to do more on the oranges, to try to interview the earliest professional environmental people in the state of Florida. So when Florida first started, after Earth Day, started passing laws for land acquisition and water protection and stormwater, those men and the women that were also hired at that time were starting to retire, and it seemed like it would be interesting to interview them. But I finally decided, well, maybe I'll just go back to this list and try and figure out how long they live. And so that I graduated from the from USF's Florida Studies program in 2011, and Dr. Mormino said, well, you should talk to the University of Florida Press about making this into a book. So I did. And then 10 years later, it was published. So there were, I think there are 9 chapters that didn't make it into the book. There was a lot of anguish about what, I wanted a lot more illustrations, and I was limited in the number of illustrations, but it's really gratifying to finally have it out and into people's hands.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I think one thing I was thinking about is just how science is long-term. And so it's neat to see when someone takes a topic and runs with it for a length of time.
So here's a question about the variegated palms on 17th Street. And the gentleman there sells seedlings of the 2 plants for a hefty price. And some of the seedlings come true to type. And that's all true. The gentleman's name is Ace Holland. He's a complete character. He has a sign out front that says rooms to rent and something like a discount if you're willing to be drug tested. He sells firewood. And Ace told me that I believe his son found the mother palm that produced the seeds of the 3 that he has growing along 17th Street. And they went back to get seeds, and it had been cut down because apparently a number of people believe that the lack of chlorophyll suggests the tree is diseased. And so some people kill them. But he had the 3 and they started producing fruit. And so I think he worked with some other folks to get them germinated. And he's been selling like 3-gallon cabbage palms for a lot of money. So yes, that's one of the best places. Those are all, in captivity, but you can see variegated cabbage palms out at Mayac River State Park. There's one at the parking lot in Venice behind the county administration building. So the area of Manatee and Sarasota County, as far as I can tell, has the greatest density of these variegated palms. And Selby at one point had actually purchased a variegated palm, and there was a newspaper article claiming that it might be worth $10,000, but it died. So you can't see one right now at Selby, but they're out there, and in general, cabbage palms transplant pretty well. And so people frequently try to bring them into captivity, which works well if the tree is mature and has 8 or 10 feet of trunk. But what happens is people will spot these little ones and dig them up, and the little palms don't have enough reserves to grow a complete new set of roots. And so like the hand ferns, they die. And if you see one that's small and want to move it, you have to be patient till it grows a trunk. But that's a good question. They're sort of a local specialty, and I should probably include those in the review of some interesting local cabbage palms.
Does anybody else have any burning questions while we have Jono here? I have one other question that I wanted to ask Jono, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
Which is, you mentioned that cabbage palms can be invasive. Is there like a situation in which they would be problematic other than just maybe being in a space that you don't want?
Yeah,
like, find them appealing?
Yeah, it's a big problem in a number of places. So one of the chapters in the book deals with the Florida Panther Refuge. And so as you might imagine, it's a national wildlife refuge. And one of the main reasons for its existence is to try and support Florida panthers. Well, panthers want to eat things like rabbits and smaller prey, hogs and stuff like that. And those animals do really well in a grassy, wet prairie or dry prairie kind of setting where there's a lot of grass-like plants for them to root up or nibble on. What's happened throughout in the area around the Fakahatchee and in the Big Cypress and the Picayune Strand is that historically a lot of drainage went in. And when people put these drainage canals in, they found that a single drainage canal could lower the water table as much as 3 miles away. So historically, these areas flooded, and they flooded often enough and deep enough to prevent cabbage palm seedlings from getting established. The cabbage palms would only really be in the highest areas. But once the water table was lowered and the flooding reduced, that meant that cabbage palm seedlings could get a foothold. So once the seedlings start growing up, they shade out the grass, and as they gain height, there's nothing that deer, rabbits, pigs can eat on a cabbage. They can't eat the bark, and there's not as much growing underneath. So the more cabbage palms you have, the less panthers you're going to have. Now the panthers do use them to, do the claw raking like your cat does on the arm of your couch, but that's pretty insignificant use compared to what that they need to eat. So so it's a big problem for people that are trying to restore panther habitat. It's a problem in the Picayune Strand. They have, because of the drainage, they have cabbage palms coming up under cypress trees. Well, if a fire goes through there, it will kill the cypress trees, and then the cabbage palms will survive. And so in the meantime, they're trying to restore the water levels and reflood everything and make it more suitable for the cypress. But in the meantime, if a fire comes in, it'll kill the cypress and they'll just end up with more cabbage palms. So there's an issue there. They're problematic for red-cockaded woodpeckers. Red-cockaded woodpeckers nest in old pines that have a particular kind of heart rot. And these pines ideally are fairly scattered. But if a cabbage palm grows up near one of these pines, that can be a place where a raptor can perch. And then as the woodpecker comes out, the raptor can sail over and nail so you don't want any palm trees coming up near your roost or your nest trees for the red-cockaded woodpecker. So, and there are other examples. So yeah, it's ironic or paradoxical, but there are a number of places in Florida where people who are managing natural systems are deliberately trying to reduce the number of cabbage palms. And that's a factor in Oscar Shearer as well. If there are too many cabbage palms in scrub jay habitat, that's problematic for scrub jays. But the irony or paradox there, which I write about in the book, is that the scrub jays seem kind of reliant on those fibers to line their nest. And no one really knows if there were no cabbage palms near Oscar Shearer, exactly what they would line their nest with, because you couldn't really raise the young in just those spiky, if you know what an oak twig is like, they're incredibly stiff. They're almost like spines. And the scrub jays, when they make their nest, do not hop around on the ground looking for twigs. They actually perch in an oak tree and snap the twig off with their beak and then build the nest out of it. So without the lining, it's not clear how things would work out. So they both depend on the cabbage palms apparently, and the cabbage palms are also threatening if there's too many of them. So yes, they're not only a problem in the urban setting, but for natural area managers, they can also be a problem. Is cabbage palm popular for harvesting part of palm? Not so much anymore. It used to be. You could still go to the Swamp Cabbage Festival in February down in La Belle, Florida, and they serve it there. In some rural areas, you drive around Florida, it'll be on the menu. And people who have old timer events or cowboy events will harvest some and serve it, but it's not harvested to the extent that I think it poses any real threat to the trees. I mean, there are more coming up than are being harvested for food. But yes, people still do harvest cabbage palms for the hearts. The hearts that you buy in the supermarket are from Central or South American trees now, not from native cabbage palms. And there's now a new, I saw the cans in the supermarket the other day. There's a new, I think it's like a pasta that's made from palm hearts and is supposed to, I don't know what its feature. I guess it has no gluten or whatever, but it's a new food product that utilizes palm hearts. So there's been a concern for many years that if this palm heart thing really caught on, it could jeopardize the population, but it never really seems to materialize. It hasn't been a big threat to date, and it would take a total, Oprah Winfrey kind of fad for it to pose any real issue. Yes, it does kill the palm. It's fatal for the palm in question, and you just have to hope there are a lot of other palm trees. So, in North Carolina or South Carolina, harvesting cabbage palms for food might be kind of, raised eyebrows. But in the Big Bend area of Florida or in the prairies near Lake Okeechobee, there's so many cabbage palms that it kills the individual tree, but it's not an issue for the population. We probably have time for one more question.
Gonna give a couple more seconds in case somebody else has one.
Either I answered everyone's question, or I don't know what the other explanation is.
Well, Jono, the title of the talk was our state tree. So do you know how it was chosen as our state tree?
With great difficulty. It was the Federation of Garden Clubs, the Garden Club women, that nominated it as the state tree. It took many years, from the 30s, I believe, till the 50s to actually be adopted. And what's curious is that South Carolina had been called the Palmetto State probably since the late 1700s. But the Carolina legislature had never taken any official action to ratify that, to say that the palmetto is the official tree of Carolina. So when the Garden Club people started, advocating to make the cabbage palm the state tree, the legislature in South Carolina swung into action and immediately passed legislation saying that the palmetto, which is what they call the cabbage palm, would be the state tree of South Carolina. And it was hoped that that would deter Florida, and they would, pick a magnolia or a royal palm or a poinciana or something else, but it didn't. But it was a long battle. The interests in the Panhandle, where there are far fewer cabbage palms, were more in favor of the slash pine. There were some people in Miami that thought the royal palm should be the state tree. The whole campaign and effort was interrupted by the Second World War. And it eventually took until the 50s before it was officially made the state tree. And then it took until the 70s before the coconut palm. If you remember my introduction, the state seal until 1970 had a coconut palm on it. And somebody finally argued in the legislature that it didn't make any sense if the state tree was now a cabbage palm to have a coconut on the state seal. So they eventually switched out the coconut for the cabbage palm. And you can actually go see the cabbage palm that appears on the state seal. The tree that was photographed to create that image is still at the old Capitol building in Tallahassee. And as far as I know, it's the only plant or tree depicted in a state seal where an individual can actually see the tree that was depicted.
That's a super cool fact.
It is a funky fact.
Well, thank you so much, Jono. It looks like everyone's expressing how much that they enjoyed your talk. So thank you so much for presenting today. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. We look forward to seeing you at the next talk.
Yeah, you're welcome. You check out the book and see if you like it. And just let people know to stop over pruning their palms.
A good takeaway. All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye.